Timothy Ferris here with a few words about writing. I've been fortunate in that I've spent my career as a professional writer and have taught writing at various universities. I'm a nonfiction writer, but in this little talk I'll try to emphasize aspects of writing that apply, I think, to fiction as well, and also hopefully can be useful to anyone who has to write on occasion, whether or not they make a career of it. It can be a tricky business, I thought, because both my parents and many of their friends were journalists and could write, therefore, that form of nonfiction that has to do with events that are just happening in the present moment, that I knew how to write journalism too. It never dawned on me that I hadn't really ever written a straight news story. I got all the way through college that way. And then in the first semester of law school, they had a little one-credit course that we were all required to take on writing. It was taught by a journalist. The school was trying to address the problem that many good lawyers didn't write that well. Their writing was too full of Latin phrases and repetitions of things other people had said, and were just somehow kind of boring to read. And judges, amongst others, were interested in trying to improve the quality of lawyers' writing. So in the first meeting of this little class, the journalist explained to us how you write a news lead. That's basically a one sentence, maybe 30 to 40 words, that tells you usually the famous 5 W's: where, when, what happened, why it happened, perhaps. These basic facts of the story conveyed with efficiency and interest. So as I say, I thought I already knew how to do this, so I left it for the end of my homework assignment that night, and it was about midnight when I'd finished my other law school homework and got to this, where all you had to do was take a fact sheet that had been provided to us and write a news lead. And an hour later, I still hadn't done it. I began to realize that this was tougher than I had thought. So I do recommend it to all writers, including even poets. I've had a couple of poets as well as other sorts of fiction writers in my classes over the years. It's really a great way to teach yourself how to write with economy and vitality. By way of example, here's the lead to, in this case, an obituary that I read in today's New York Times just this morning, written by Anita Gates, and it reads as follows. Anne Perry, the prolific London-born author of historical and socially conscious crime fiction, who in her teens served 5 years in prison for murder, a sordid past that came to wide attention with the release of a 1994 movie, died Monday in Los Angeles, at the age of 84. So a sentence like that gives you an encapsulated version of what is to follow, and then each successive paragraph extrapolates roughly in order of their importance or newsworthiness, different aspects of that lead, as the journalists call that first sentence. Good writing is more like singing than it's like an intellectual activity, and you may notice in your typos that they often result because the brain is hearing the word and has simply misspelled it. In teaching writing, one is in the position of being a coach of singers or athletes. You can bring someone along, you can improve their game, so to speak, but ultimately it's up to them how far they can take it. I found in school that the students who had the easiest time with term papers, who could bang out a decent term paper that would get an A and move on to the next assignment, weren't usually the students who were going to end up being writers. The real writers have a lot of trouble with term papers because they can imagine or almost hear what better writing would be about. They would like to write better, but they realize they don't know enough about the subject. So often with a term paper, you have to be superficial because you don't have the depth of knowledge that you need to write something better. And that leads me to the first of 3 points I'll try to make about good writing. These are accuracy, economy, and vitality. Accuracy refers to the fact that you can't write well about a subject if you don't understand the subject. As a rule of thumb for my students doing particularly work that you have a week or two to get written, more like a magazine article than a daily news story, you should try to accumulate enough research so that it adds up to between 5 and 10 times as much information as will end up in your story. If you're just taking everything you've been able to learn and shoveling it into the news story, you probably haven't learned enough to write it particularly well. Now, realistically, sometimes you won't have any choice. But if you have the luxury to write a long magazine piece or a book, then you've got an opportunity to learn. And one of the great things about being a nonfiction writer is you get paid to learn. So the life of a nonfiction writer, and many fiction writers too, writers that come to mind among my own generation, fiction writers like Tom McGuane and Jim Harrison, learned a great deal about the world they were writing about. They're kind of experts. That's what gives their fiction a sense of reality, because it's based in so much factual reality. You also need to know what you're talking about to have a good style. I used to tell my students that if you're writing a sentence or a paragraph that really is giving you style problems, you can't seem to get it to read properly, stop and ask yourself whether what you are trying to say is true. A lot of times the style is signaling you that there's something wrong with what you're trying to write, that it doesn't fit into the world of facts and reason. The way the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer put it was that the first rule of a good style is to have something to say. Now, in addition to writing for accuracy, writers also edit themselves for accuracy and style. And that's the great strength of writing. It's a funny business because every literate person can write, but to write well enough that someone will pay money to read what you've written requires that you keep reworking your drafts to make them more accurate, more interesting to read, deeper, more resonant, all these things that characterize good art in general. In a sense, a professional writer is someone who is willing to work 90-some-odd% of the time with inferior materials, because so much of your time is spent writing drafts that aren't that great and then going over them again and again until they start to emerge as something better, or until particular passages or pages have to be thrown away altogether. There are all sorts of mental tricks that take place in this process. Many writers, including myself, have found that in a long project, such as maybe a 5,000, 10,000 word magazine article or an entire book, you'll go through periods of self-doubt and stress when you think maybe this isn't going to work at all. It's just so hard. And writing is hard, in part because it's all on your shoulders. You don't really have any help with it. And in such periods, you might say to yourself, I know this work has some potential because there's this wonderful thing in it. I've already written this wonderful paragraph or this wonderful page, or I have this wonderful story. And oddly enough, at the end of that project, that's the thing you'll end up throwing out. The wonderful thing that carried you maybe through years of work. I've worked as much as 10 or 12 years on one book. And in the end, the thing that helped you get there turns out not really to belong in the book after all. It's a hard business, but you start to realize, well, okay, he was a good friend along the way, but he's going to have to go if this work is going to be finished. Good writers tend to be good editors. It's not always true, but it helps a lot if you have the ability to come back each day and look at what you wrote on the day before and determine whether it's going to be able to stay. Does it qualify as a first draft, or make it better until it does? You don't want to over-polish at that stage because you're going to be throwing a lot of stuff away anyhow. But it's a kind of a balance and a willingness to keep working with a substandard version of what you can or hope to accomplish as a writer. So that first point was accuracy. The second is economy. Nothing is more important to any communicator than the audience's time. Don't beat around the bush if there's a better and more effective way to state something clearly and succinctly. Now, I don't mean that good writing should be stripped down to the point of being like a text message. What you want to be is economical while achieving the results that you're after. So if you're writing a descriptive passage, for instance, the answer isn't to use as few words as possible, but rather to use the words that move forward with your description. In one of my writing classes, we used to use a paragraph from one of Ernest Hemingway's books, a descriptive paragraph, to see just how efficiently a writer on that level can work. The paragraph had to do with deep sea fishing. There was a marlin hitting a line in the ocean off the coast of Cuba. We all read the paragraph, then we turned the page over, and we talked about what we'd seen. We could see the chop and the blue-green water, the fishing boat, the line, the stretched pole, the fish tail walking before diving into the depths. It was quite an effective scene. Then we turned the page back up again and underlined every actual word of description in the entire passage. It was like 14 words. 14 was all Hemingway needed to create that whole picture in his readers' minds. But it was the right 14 words. On the internet these days, in narration over videos and such, you encounter a lot of unnecessary words. If someone, for instance, climbs to a high diving board and dives into the water, the narrator will inform us that he decided to dive. Well, we assume, since the dive was apparently voluntary, that he intended to dive or that he had decided to dive. So try to cut these unnecessary words and get to the point. There's no reason to talk about qualified experts. If they weren't qualified, they wouldn't be experts. You see the term completely destroyed, but that's what destroyed means. If it was partially destroyed, it was damaged, not destroyed. One reads about soldiers being completely surrounded, but that's what surrounded means. Can't be partially surrounded. Try to find a single word that'll do the job of multiple words. Very far is distant. Very large is enormous. Very intelligent is brilliant. So good writing is characterized by economy. Even a rather complex and deep writer like Flaubert, for instance, if you look at those passages that seem kind of florid, try taking a word out. They're really pretty efficient. Proust's long sentences are legendary, but there aren't any excess words in them. There's a reason those sentences are long. They don't read too long at all. Proust knew what he was doing. So that's accuracy and economy. Third point is vitality. You want your writing to stand up and stand for something, have some vitality, some strength to it, not just lie there. You want to use strong verbs instead of weak verbs. You don't say an explosion occurred in a shed, you say the shed exploded. You don't say his arrest by the police took place at dawn, you say the police arrested him at dawn. I saw a sentence the other day said they were enlistees who served in the Army for 2 years. In other words, they enlisted and served in the Army for 2 years. Sentences beginning there is, there was, there are, there were, are forcing themselves into using the to be verb form, is, are, and so forth. That's one of the weakest verbs. So one way to clear up deadwood is to, when you see a sentence that begins that way, reformulate it so that it forces you to use a stronger verb. Try to write in positive rather than negative terms because that tends to give your writing more efficiency and vitality. Not fat is thin. Not happy is unhappy. Not interested is uninterested. It's not disinterested, by the way. Disinterested means unbiased. She did not feel well could be she felt sick or she felt unwell. He was not detained means he was released. Finally, try to use simple declarative sentences as much as possible. The idea is to benefit the reader, not to show off how elaborately you can write. When you get into complicated sentence structures like dependent clauses and such, although they have their place, they can also lead into difficulty. Here are a couple of examples I encountered in student writing over the years. Bleeding from a superficial head wound, Mrs. Beerbaum worked 6 weeks as a receptionist. Now, the problem is that the introductory phrase has changed the meaning of the sentence. From an unpublished novel, helplessly, Roger watched from his study while his stomach tied itself into knots. And then my favorite from an ad I encountered in a newspaper in New York, all good things must come to an end. And now, after 6 wonderful years, you must go see Godspell on Broadway. Thanks for listening. See you next time.